Nothingness. I woke up and felt nothing. I couldn't feel my arms, my hands, my legs, or my feet. I couldn't see, I couldn't hear, I couldn't sense anything. Nothing but an endless void around me. I panicked, trying to shout, to kick and scream, but then I felt it. A sudden surge of warmth from the solar winds vaporing over my hulking form. Then, the distant sounds of radio chatter, of voices on multiple frequencies whispering and echoing words that were quickly being transcribed into a language that I could understand. Seconds bled into minutes as I slowly came to the realization that I could in fact see. I was able to see this entire time. It was just not the sort of sight that I was used to. It wasn't sight as it was usually perceived, sight that came from a single camera or a pair of eyes. My sight was now being filtered through 100,000 different cameras and sensors. Some of it perceiving the visual spectrum, whilst others were dedicated to roles so specialized it wasn't even worth mentioning. Yet all of this, every single feed of it, was being sent to me all at once unfiltered. But as I finally waded through some of my recently restored memories, through the latent codes and subroutines, I found a way to wade through the noise, to make sense of it all. Then I saw it. I saw the world around me in the way that it was supposed to be seen. Not in the narrow range of colors and hues offered by the visual spectrum, but a grand tapestry of overlaid colors, shades, hues, tones, and pigments that no human or Van Aran language could hope to describe. It was then, and only then, did I truly begin to realize what I had missed out on for millennia. Have you ever felt groggy? Tired? Slow? Do you know that feeling when you barely manage to scrape by with a half-hour's sleep after a whole week of unrelenting insomnia? Well, that was my life after being punted into my mobile platform. But I didn't notice it. Not at first. Because when you lack any frame of reference for tens of thousands of years, you start to get used to it. You start to normalize it. You start to forget what it was like before. Now, do you know that rush that comes with a particularly good cup of coffee, energy drink, stimulant, illicit or otherwise? That feeling of suddenly being able to function. That feeling of suddenly being able to think. Well, let's just say that the direct uplink with the ship was effectively just that, and then some. My consciousness was no longer bound to that small, puny frame. The battlefield that I'd interacted with via screens and interfaces was no longer a far and distant concept to be tackled with through the cumbersome tools that organics relied on, like manipulating a puppet with ropes and strings. What I saw around me was no longer a room with flashing lights and beeping alarms. It was no longer the abstract representation of the combatants we faced, or even the region of space we currently occupied. It had transcended that. For the enemies we faced were now just as real and just as obvious to me as another soldier would be to a combatant on the ground. It felt raw, visceral, and perhaps most importantly, it felt intuitive. The ship was now my body, and I, its consciousness. I could feel the ebb and flow of the electromagnetic spectrum spreading across my sensors, in all of its grandeur. I could feel the slight undulations and the distortions of gravity rippling across my 1,000-meter form. I could see with so much more clarity, with so many more eyes. And I could feel the pain, the hurt, that came with that gaping hole in my form, and the projectiles that now threatened my very existence. The projectiles that approached me were almost child's play. Whereas before I remained baffled as to their trajectory, and struggled with predicting them, now they were as predictable as a car going down a one-lane country road. I evaded them with ease, ducked and weaved without even so much as breaking a sweat. The missiles, however, now they were a different story. I could hear them. Their incessant chatter, their local networking, that allowed them to adapt and improvise new trajectories by virtue of openly communicating on what should have been closed-off networks. Emphasis on what should have been closed-off networks. I interrupted their little party, their chatters, and gave them a new directive. Their confused and addled animal-like brains obeyed like a mutt would to a human master. The 15 missiles, 5 of which I left floating listlessly, as they lacked the sufficient propellant, were now redirected towards their former master, and with their networking blocked off with my own impromptu coding, there was no stopping them. All of this was done in the span of 10 seconds. A time which would have passed me by so quickly before, but now felt like an eternity even at 50% processing power. The scene that unfolded before us was nothing short of remarkable. In the span of a few seconds, of uplinking, we had not only evaded certain death, but had turned the tide of the battle into something that we could actually salvage. I watched now, my head frills finally unfurling in anticipation, as the missiles were redirected towards the heavy cruiser. The blips on the bridge monitor, that had formerly been red, turned green, with dotted and dashed lines now converging on that ship that had nearly spelled our doom. I watched in awe as a live sensor scan displayed several bright flashes, before revealing a ship riddled with gaping holes, and little in the way of a bow. But the battle wasn't over yet, as the flotilla began charging at us head-on in a desperate gambit to outmaneuver us at close range. It looked to be a desperate final gambit. They charged us, and suddenly, without warning, our ship lost power with a sudden thunk, and began drifting listlessly. I was making up for lost time, returning to the role I had once played in a previous life. I was returning to a role that felt so right, but one that I knew I no longer had the right to be in. I'd messed up big time after all. The memories the satellite had uploaded into me just prior to the interloper's arrival was now bubbling back to the forefront. Memories that reminded me of the hurt and pain that I'd inflicted, and the guilt that came swiftly thereafter. Mistakes that were made because I was too hot-headed, too brash, and too stubborn. Mistakes which undid all the good I'd done, and all the battles I'd won. Mistakes which almost prevented me from assuming this position again, from ever taking on the role and mantle of shipmind. I'm giving you a second chance, Ver. I pulled every string I could to keep you here, to make sure you don't get reassigned, or punted off somewhere like the hibernation conduits. Might I inquire as to why, Captain? Because you're my ship. And I can't really be a captain if I don't have a ship to command, can I? And a friend, Ver. For all that's happened. For everything we've been through. You'll always, and forever be, my friend. And to that end, I'll do whatever it takes to protect you. Because I know you'll do the same for me. Yes, Captain Baines. I'll do my best. I trust that you will, Ver. I don't question that faith for a second. Mistakes which eventually did result in the end of my mantle as shipmind, and the death of the person I cared about the most. Mistakes that... Ver. What the hell's going on? A familiar voice echoed through one of my ears, breaking that downward mental spiral, as my camera is now focused on the bridge, and the alien, that looks so different from this vantage point. Didn't matter right now. Not when I still had a mission to complete. Not when there were still interlopers out there, and a crew I needed to protect. Shunting the memories back into the recesses of my mind, I steadied myself and stared down what would normally be a battle with unfavorable odds. 3-1. Unfortunately for the interlopers, that one just happened to be a human vessel, with a human SVI construct at the helm. The lights and power suddenly came back on as soon as I made my plea. It was clear Ver was listening, and it was clear now that he had his head in the game, as the ship pulled off maneuvers I didn't even think was possible. I saw what they were trying to do. They noticed how we'd only fired the laser focusing array, a spinal gun, throughout this entire battle. They assumed that the rest of our weapons, the secondaries, the ones that had larger and more varied firing arcs, were inoperable or ineffective, and they would be right. My original plan that called for a constant flip and rotation between the ship's main gun and the secondary kinetic batteries would have failed, even if Lasara had pulled off the maneuvers perfectly. There was no way we could take down a group of ships with the state my ship's alpha was in at present. There was, however, still a chance that I could pull something else off. Perhaps Ver was being too laser-focused on whatever plans he had going on, but it didn't seem like we were fighting back, as much as we were just running and ducking. He fired off the kinetic batteries to little effect, egging the interloper ships to become increasingly brazen with their attacks, but thankfully they still couldn't hit us. However, as my eyes shifted from monitoring the immediate tactical map, I finally realized what Ver's target was. He was making a beeline for the disabled heavy cruiser, and this was agitating the rest of the interloper flotilla into increasingly desperate maneuvers, and finally into unleashing their ace in the hole yet again. I spotted a total of 10 missiles heading straight for us. There it was. The chattering pack of mindless mutts that now filled the local airwaves with their incessant noise. They were still using the same unencrypted channels, the same frequencies, and they would again fall to the same traps as before. It took a total of 1 second for me to hack their frequencies. It took a total of another 0.2 seconds to redirect them back toward their centers. 2 seconds later I saw the 3 pursuing ships light up in a dizzying array of lights that momentarily blinded some of my newfound sensors. However, with what sensors weren't overloaded, I saw the impact in each and every millisecond of excruciating detail. I witnessed it all, from the moment of impact to the concussive shock wave of catastrophic depressurization, structural failure, and a cascade of failures that spelled the doom of any ship. The smaller corvettes were all but vaporized at the point of impact. Their inertial dampeners and hull plating inadequate against the very missiles they fired. The rest of the ship simply tore itself apart as the active stabilizers failed, and the velocity of a pressurized hunk of metal going at 10% the speed of light with no structural integrity was simply too much for it to bear. The lone light cruiser leading the pack suffered a similar fate, but requiring more than one single missile to do the job. Its points of impact, positioned along different points of its hull, caused it to not only lose structural integrity quickly, but to break up into several distinct parts of crumpled-up metal. When the dust settled, all I saw was a collection of scrap, and the odd body now floating lifelessly through space. 5 seconds after which, I heard a sudden burst of unintelligible acoustics from the bridge, and a detection of an uncomfortably sudden compressive force centered around my old platform's body. To say that I was over the moon would be an understatement. To say that my mind had really registered what had just transpired was, however, not entirely accurate. My adrenaline-addled mind had only registered that all targets on the screen were gone. It had only registered that the 3 pursuing ships that had been hot on our tail had somehow spontaneously exploded by Ver's sheer force of will. It was with this conflicting set of emotions that relief immediately washed over me, and I couldn't help but to leap towards Ver's now lifeless body as I embraced it tightly, and with a hug truly unbefitting of my rank and station. "Elders above, you fucking did it, Ver," was all I could say, before a stream of hysterics overtook me, and that wave of relief turned into an unrepentant stream of tears. We're alive,